I'll try not to yell. I'm Brian Fox, and I am a open source and free software advocate. Let there be no doubt about that. Today I'm going to talk a lot about open source, but first I thought I would tell you a little bit about me and how I got started. That's my nursery school class. You might be able to figure out which one is me. When I was 6 years old, my dad worked at Bolperanic and Newman. He's a physicist, and he had a teletype in the basement. And I used to sneak down to the basement and push the control key and the G key because it made a nice big dinging sound. And as everybody knows, that's the abort for modern apps, and especially for Emacs, and that's still my favorite key. At BBN, where my dad was a physicist, there were several important people working, important to me later, including Wally Fertzig, who was one of the core inventors of Logo, the Logo programming language. And when I was about 7 or 8, my dad took me over there because they were trying to create something new with the Logo language, and they wanted a younger person to work with it. Marvin Minsky was a good friend of mine and a very good friend of my father's. Seymour Papert was a friend of mine and a guy that I almost worked for. See, these people were very important in my life. I guess maybe I should get it better. Oh, there we go. So computers were pretty important to me, but they weren't the only thing I ever did. I enjoyed skateboarding. That's me at age 15, thinking about skateboarding and working with the local skateboard team. Then around age 17, the Trash 80 came out. And this was a Z80 processor in a machine that Radio Shack built, which is why it was called the Tandy Radio Shack 80. I loved this machine, and there was a Radio Shack near my house. I used to go over there and type up basic programs that would draw graphic things so that the store would let me sit there because I was making demos basically for the store, and I was learning how to program. That's where I wrote my first significant program, something that solved the problem of roulette. It failed miserably. I'm also a musician. I play the bass, and around age 18, I went to California. I was born and raised in Boston, sorry. Around 18, I went to California and began playing bass. I played in a top 40 band called Success. The band was a lot of fun, and we worked a lot of places, and I found myself sleeping one night while I was playing. It was an interesting experience. No one in the band knew I was sleeping except for the drummer, who heard me snoring because I continued to play the song. He poked me with a stick to wake me up, and I thought, maybe just playing top 40 isn't for me. So I moved on to Santa Barbara City College. I knew I was going to come back to Boston to do something interesting, and I went to Santa Barbara City College, where I lasted for 3 months before they kicked me out. They specifically kicked me out because at the time, the computing environment was a machine called the Data General Eclipse 330. It was like a big washing machine. And next to it, there was a big disk drive, looked like a washing machine also. And we had terminals. You would type stuff in terminals, and then that would be batched. Your COBOL program or your Pascal program would be batched, and we'd send it off to be processed, and later you'd go get your printout. Well, the way you typed your program in was horrible. There was no real editor. You just kind of typed, and if you made a mistake, you were screwed. You had to kind of redo everything. And they eventually got a brand new editor called Speed. And Speed was exciting because you could see your code on the screen, and then you would hit a key that let you type in a bunch of junk, and then you press something, and hopefully that went where you thought it was going to go, or you'd be screwed. So that was pretty terrible. And then Line Edit came out right after that from Data General. And Line Edit looked like more like what you might expect a modern editor to look like. You could move a cursor around and edit lines at a time. But it crashed all the time. So myself and another guy took the binary, copied the binary into our home directories, and started modifying the machine language of the binary in order to make it not crash. And we succeeded at that, but the guy running the lab didn't like it, and he kicked me out of school. So that's when I discovered the Apple. It was 1980 or 1981, I think. I'd never seen graphics on a computer screen before. I'd only seen a terminal. I thought it was amazing, and I thought it was much better than the Trash 80. So I started playing with that. When I got back to Boston, I looked up my friend Marvin, who was the... Does everybody know who Marvin Minsky is? Marvin Minsky was the head of the Artificial Intelligence Lab and the creator, some say the creator of artificial intelligence, at MIT. And I wanted to be able to use computers, so I went over to MIT to say hi to Marvin and ask if I could use some computers. And he said, sure, just find something that's not being used and use it. I said, okay. I also went back to my old high school, Brookline High, and I said, I'm happy to teach people how to do things on a computer if you let me use the computers that you own. And they said, you have to ask this woman over here. And I said, okay, I'll ask her. So I asked her, and she said, yeah, teach my math class tomorrow. so that's exactly what happened. So the following day, without any sleep, I went and taught her math class, which I'm not that good at math, so that was fun. But then I had access to the computers at the school, and I could also go over to MIT when I wanted to. When I first started hanging around MIT, there was a guy sitting in front of this space that had this giant vertical bitmap terminal. It was all black and white, and it was densely packed with words and parentheses. And then next to it, there was a TV set that had a circuit diagram on it. And this guy would type in things that almost looked like English, but they were always in parentheses. And he would say things like, draw line 5 high, and then over here, something would turn red that used to be green. And I was like, what is this? What is happening? How is this working? Who is this guy? And the guy was Danny Weinreb, who's now gone, unfortunately, but one of the more important people in AI and in Lisp. And he was sitting at a Lisp machine, and that was crazy. He also would reach over and grab this thing, and he'd move it, and then this arrow would move around on a screen. And if he moved it to the right, it would move from that screen to another screen. And I was sitting behind him just for like hours watching him move this mouse around. I was completely blown away. I had no idea what it was. At some point, I started using an X10 machine at the Athena lab, and they had a mouse that looked like this. And I tried to roll the mouse, and the mouse wasn't working, so I banged it, and I rolled it some more, and I banged it, and eventually I broke it. I quickly left the lab. The only keyboard ever worth using is the Space Cadet keyboard. This was the Lisp machine keyboard, and if you've never typed Hyper, Meta, Control, Alt, Shift, you don't know what life was all about. So I had mentioned that when I was younger, I met Wally Fertzig, and he had turned me on to this, he was trying out some application he had written on a mainframe, but the application was called Logo. And he had a little test app. I don't even remember what it was supposed to do, but I was supposed to interact with it. But I loved that Control-G dinging sound. So when he left the room to leave me to interact with it, I typed Control-G, and immediately it broke out of his program. And I was at the kind of command line interface for the Logo programming language. And so I started talking to it. And they had done such a good job that I was able to kind of communicate with it and understand what it was doing. I'm like, hello, and it says, define hello. So I'm like, okay, define hello. And I press return, and it says, you can't define it, you have to hello. I'm like, okay, so I start interacting with it. And Wally comes running into the room, and he says, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm just using the thing like you told me to. And he said, well, how did you get here? I said, I typed Control-G. And he goes, well, how do you know what to say to it? I said, it told me. It told me what to say to it. And I think that really kind of freaked him out. And then And then now it is fast forward to 1981 or so, 1982. And now I've done such a good job teaching that math class for that lady that I've now been given the job of teaching gifted and talented 7th and 8th graders. Maybe the most fun job I've ever had, actually. And the thing I'm teaching them is how to use computers, and I'm teaching them the logo language. And the logo language I'm using is a logo written for the Apple II by Patrick Sobelvaro and Lee Klotz. And it was made by a company called Terrapin. Well, this program also used to crash. And so one day, while I was teaching these guys stuff, the program crashed, and I was in there patching it on the Apple. I was in there patching it so that it would start running again, and they wouldn't lose all their Turtle graphics work they'd done. And the owner of the Terrapin company came in and saw me doing that and hired me on the spot. That was exciting because I then started hanging around with Lee Klotz and Patrick Sobelvaro, two guys I had seen at the AI lab. And the end result was I wrote Terrapin logo for the Apple IIe and the Apple II GS. And that was my first experience writing a programming language, but not my last. This maniac here is a friend of mine. Some of you might know who he is. That's Richard Stallman. You might consider him to be the founder of open source. He wasn't alone, and it's very interesting. How I met Richard, I had written on the Apple in order to write the logo language, I had to use a computer at BBN, actually. And the computer at BBN was running a program called Emacs, and that's what I used to edit this assembly language. And the program was so well constructed that I found myself fascinated with Emacs itself, just the consistency of all the software. It became clear to me that I could kind of guess what the programmer was thinking about when he did the next thing. And it was beautiful and elegant to me, because I'm a little weird like that. And so then I got excited and I went home, and on my Apple II, I spent 2.5 months doing nothing except drinking tea and writing software, writing machine language software, and I wrote a version of Emacs for the Apple II, which ran in 48K with bank switched memory, and it was pretty crazy, but it worked quite well. It had MetaX completion and dynamically loadable libraries and all this great stuff. And I was very excited, and I was on my way over to MIT to talk to various people at the lab, and this guy comes out, and I'm like, that's Richard Stallman. That's the guy that wrote Emacs. That's the guy I got to talk to. And I ran up, I said, Richard, he says, yes. I said, I wrote this thing. It's Emacs for the Apple, and it's great, and I think it's fantastic. And, I'm talking to my hero, and I just want my hero to know about how much I love the work that he did, that I ended up doing it myself. And he said, I don't think I'd be a good distribution point for that, and left. That's how I met Richard Stallman, and I didn't talk to him for about 1.5 years after that. And that's what he looked like when I started working with him. That's what I looked like when I started working with him. Things change over time. When I met him the second time, it's because I'd worked with Lee and Patrick, and Lee and Patrick said to me, you should work with Richard Stallman. He's trying to do something brand new, and he's looking for hackers. I said, okay. So I went over, I knocked on his door, and he opened the door, and I'm no longer impressed with Richard. After all, he's not a good distribution point for my software. And he says, oh, Patrick tells me you're a wizard. So I realized he has never seen me before as far as he's concerned. So I said, okay. And then he literally ran around the lab with me chasing him as he was going to get some printout and came back. And the whole time he's talking to me over his shoulder. Right? That was my introduction. So I did take the job. The Free Software Foundation actually got started almost exactly when I took that job in 1984. It was his foundation to support the project that he had just started the month before I started working for him, called GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix, for those of you who don't know what GNU stands for. And at that point, he started putting together this Free Software Foundation. It took a year to get it done, but then he had a 501c3 organization, nonprofit, and it could support that. And the money that came into the Free Software Foundation paid my salary at the time. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of Emacs as it relates to the Free Software Foundation and the GNU project, because I think people think open source is magic, but open source isn't magic. It's kind of what everybody's been doing all along. It's the way people think about, it's the way us computer programmers think about information and the sharing of information. So in 1972, Stallman took a program that was running on some PDP-10s, and it's called Tico. It was an editor, and he added keystroke macros to it. So that meant that instead of having to exit and do some commands, you could actually just type keys while you were busy editing and see the changes happen immediately on the screen. And this was pretty new. This is 7 years before I started playing with that other editor from Data General. And then in '76, David Moon and Guy Steele said, "This is funny. Everybody in the lab has their own little set of keystrokes. You know, why don't we put them all into one central place so that everyone can get the benefit of the shared keystrokes?" So they did that. They collected them all, and they called that thing Tmax, but it was simply Tico with all the collected macros in it. And then in 1978, the god, Daniel Weinreb, he wrote a program called INA for a Lisp machine. INA stands for INA is not Emacs, and it was the first Emacs written in Lisp. Later on, Zwei was written, and Zwei stands for Zwei was eine initially. And for those of you who don't know German, that's 1 and 2 in German. So, and then in '81, this is when the proverbial stuff starts to hit the fan. Gosling writes Gosling Emacs for Unix, and he was one of the first one of these people, first in this group, to decide to attach his name to this piece of software. But it was important. Unix didn't have a good text editor. It didn't have a good, basically IDE. People like to think of Emacs as a text editor, but I like to think of it as a development environment. And so what he did was important. And in '83, Stallman was angry with Gosling because Gosling was trying to monetize his work and not share it with everyone. So Stallman starts the GNU project specifically to create a free Unix, he said, but actually because he wanted to write an Emacs that was free for everyone. And so he did that. That's kind of the beginning of what I think we call open source now. I've had the luck and pleasure to have written some free software for people. Some of it you may have used. Originally, I wrote this Make Info program, which is a compiler for tech info. It's a documentation format loosely based on tech, which can compile into straight tech, or it can compile into HTML. It can compile into the info format, which was a text-based hypertext system. I also wrote the standalone info reader, documentation reader, which is delivered standard. These are delivered standard with all Linux-based systems. I was the maintainer of Emacs for a couple years. I wrote the readline library, which is used in a wide variety of software, including GDB and FTP and things like that. Anywhere you see a command line that's doing proper editing, it's the readline library. And if you see one that looks like it kind of is working, but then sometimes doesn't, it's not the readline library. I needed to be compatible with the things that other people were used to using. People had been using CSH and TCSH and so forth. So I wrote a history library, which lets you type things like exclamation mark PR, and then it finds the most recent thing that you typed that starts with PR, things like that. It also manages to hold on to all the input you've typed in and does good things with it. And then later on, I did remote kernel debugging for GDB. I wrote the GNU finger program, which is interesting on its own, but I'll tell you about that some other time. And then I wrote this thing called Bash. So the order of the software that I wrote is not exactly right. I wrote Make Info. I wrote the info reader first. It took me about 4 or 5 days. And when I was done with it, I said to Richard, he had said, write something that works. When I was done with it, I went to see Richard, and all my previous serious programming experience had been in assembly language. So my approach to putting a character on the screen was, find out how many bits are in the character, figure out where it's supposed to go on the screen, draw that on the screen, and look at the next character and figure you're supposed to draw that. That's not the way you do things in a modern operating system. So I showed it to Stallman, and I said, my program works, and it does everything it's supposed to do, but the I.O. is really slow. It takes a long time to repaint the screen. He says, let me look. And then he looks at it, and then he says to me, your approach to I.O. looks like an attack on Grenada. So I said, thanks. And then he explains about buffering. So then I start using buffering. It takes me another, 2 or 3 hours to fix that. And then I come back to him and I go, there, it's better. And he goes, yeah, that's better. Now you should do all these features. I said, all those features are done. He said, what about this feature? I said, well, I told you it was done. It just was slow, So he didn't really get that. That was my first C program. MakeInfo was my second C program. And Bash is my third C language program ever. Yeah. And I explained earlier to someone who was standing here that the magic is you write a piece of software, it turns out to be useful, so useful that people don't delete it, and then you wait. If you wait long enough, you stand here and give a talk. Now, I know Bash is really cool because people put the word pro in front of it, so. I also want to talk a little bit about GNU/Linux, or GNU versus Linux, and what the differences are. I think most of you seem familiar with that already. GNU is a collection of all the software you need to make a complete Unix-like operating system. The thing that was missing for years, and there was a political reason behind that, was the kernel. MIT and X11 provided the X11 windowing system, which was great, but that was not required for us to have a complete Unix-like operating system. That was just a nice GUI. And then Linus Torvalds got tired of not having a complete system, and so he wrote a kernel, and he did a really good job. So we've talked a little about the software that's out there, and we talk about Linux and open source, and I just want to say that's GNU is not the only place that open source exists now. It was in 1984, but it's not that way anymore. And we're not just talking about all these PHP applications over here. There's also Apache, which everybody thinks about. By the way, I have to tell you, I think Apache is like the worst name ever for software I've ever. If I said I'm going to start a new project tomorrow, I'm going to call it, Navajo, how happy would people be about that? So I apologize that I'm in any way associated with Apache. But open source doesn't just appear in these projects. It appears everywhere. It's most likely in your router, at your house, or your wireless router. It shows up in places where you don't expect it. Here's a machine booting, the vending machine booting. It shows up in places where you do expect it, like this phone that Google made, right? Or these devices, like this watch or this TV set, right? It's beginning to permeate everything you touch. And there are things that you don't know that run Linux, like these giant printers are running full-on open source, in this particular case, running Linux. They're not just straight open source. And then you might go home, turn on your refrigerator. This is an actual refrigerator from Samsung, runs Linux. I use it to mine Bitcoin. No, I don't do it. But I do like money. So people often ask me, this is the biggest question I had for decades was, because I can tell you in the 90s, if you told the company you were working for, we should make this open source, they just looked at it like you were crazy. They said, why would you make that open source? We just spent 15 grand patenting that thing that you created on your own at home and then brought in and gave to us. Why would you do that? And I said, because this way we can make something better for somebody else, and they can make something better for us. It's just sharing information. Why wouldn't we do that? And they say, because you can't make any money. How are you going to make money doing that? Because that's all anybody ever cares about. So one kind of clear way to make money is through customization. You take something like the Linux kernel, and you customize it for a specific purpose, like in this case, DDWRT, for example, and make a router distro out of it. Or make end-user distros, ones where you turn them on and you're not supposed to have to know anything about how computers work except that you can click on things and drag things around, like Red Hat, Canonical, and so forth. Or you can make these kind of crazy ecosystems that revolve around a single piece of software. Kind of like the way Linux is, although Linux is a bigger platform. But you take a look at something like WordPress. Well, you take a look at WordPress. Another way to make money, apparently a really good way, is to provide support. Cygnus is a great example of that. My friend Gumby. Gumby worked at the AI lab. He was a graduate student at the AI lab. He was getting his PhD in history. He was 15 years old, 16 when I met him, and he wrote DirEdit for the list machine. He was doing nothing with history, but he was getting his PhD at the AI lab in history somehow. So Gumby's a fantastic human being. Michael Tiemann, another great guy, and of course John Gilmore, who some people might know is the guy who wrote the Sun microkernel, the Sun kernel for Sun Microsystems. And he's a big guy at the EFF, Electronic Freedom Foundation. And these guys started a company called Cygnus. They had 2 apartments in an apartment complex in Palo Alto. So 2 guys were living in one and 1 guy was living in the other. They ran Ethernet from, coax from one house to the other house, and they started hiring people to help them manage software. And they ended up having like 10 or 12 employees in these 2 apartments, which were their homes. But that was how they got their company started. And their company was called Cygnus, which stood for Cygnus is your GNU support. Yeah, good, right? And their premise was very, very clever, very clever. They said companies like Motorola spend a lot of money, when they make a new chip, spend a lot of money having a whole team create a compiler for that chip. And that company, Motorola, would like to use open source software. They'd like to use GCC, for example. But then they still have to hire a team to manage GCC. And these guys said, why don't we just keep GCC up to date on some CDs, and we'll ship 4 CDs a year to them, and we'll charge them $100K. And specifically, Motorola said, that's a great idea. Why don't you do that? It'll save me money. And so they did that, and then Motorola would say, by the way, we have a brand new chip. Would you make the compiler work with that chip? So they also had consulting money coming out of that. They merged with Red Hat in 1999. The deal was worth, I think, about $700 million. So they made some good money on open source, and they created a lot of open source. They created the Cygnus system that some of you may be familiar with, which is basically a Linux-like system, a Unix-like system, subsystem that you can run inside of Windows. And then another way is just actually providing straightforward services, being a consultant, going out and doing consulting for people. And the way in which you can make that, the best way, I think, in which you can make that open source is every time somebody says, I have a problem, solve the problem, and then say, I have an open source library for you that will solve your problem. They still need the integration, they still need to do the work, and you've done something good for the world and for yourself. Nobody likes to write a piece of software, give it away to somebody else, and not be able to use it again. So if you're writing software that matters to you or that matters to, that you think will matter to other people, it's good to put it into a library so it's reusable by you and by other people, and you might as well make that whole thing be open source. The worst thing that can happen is somebody else will add to your library and make it better. You can also create brand new applications that scratch some itch that you have. That's the second point there. You can be the nexus of development for something that helps you, something that makes the world better for you. it might make it better for somebody else as well, and then you become the kind of core of that. This is what Linus Torvalds did. He needed a kernel for his otherwise operating system. And then you can straightforwardly consult to people and say, I understand you wish to use open source in your world and you don't know how to do it. Let me show you how to do it. This is the best solution for you, and this is why this will work for you. So open source seems to be what I would call a long journey. It definitely started in the 60s with Lisp and Logo at places like BBN, but not at places like Bell Labs. It got its name in the 80s when one disgruntled man decided to fight the world. It took over the world basically in the 90s after the internet showed up. Everybody needed to run a web server, and everybody needed to write applications on those web servers. And so that was the way the entire world worked. And it's no longer a swear in the enterprise like it was in the 90s. You could not talk about open source to anybody in the 90s. I think that's pretty good. And it's not just software anymore. Right? It extends into bioinformatics and into hardware. There's whole open source hardware movement where people open source their designs for FPGAs. I'm involved in creating an open source election system, which I think is maybe one of the most important things we can do today in the United States, is actually make sure that we have a transparent, auditable election system so you know your vote is counted as cast. It's not who you vote for, it's that you actually have the right to vote and that that vote counts. And then I know some of you are excited about Hacktoberfest because you might get a free t-shirt. I'm excited because I might drink some beer. So it's all the same. So I want everybody to contribute to open source. I think that all ideas are important and interesting and valid. I think that every brain that I communicate with has something to offer. And I think that instead of me just absorbing it and having it myself, it would be great if the ideas that are exchanged and sent back and forth are also available for other people to look at. You're at a university and you're learning things now, and you do that by opening a book and reading about other people's ideas or processes or thoughts, if it's philosophy, whatever it is, and that's good that you have that available to you. And it would be good if we could all be providing that to each other. So you learn from open source. You can teach. You can teach other people about open source and about how to learn from it. You've built on other people's work. I know everybody here has probably taken some application, even if it's writing a shell script, has taken some application and created something. That's great, right? Create something that other people can also add to. Use the actual physical products. Make some new ones. Bash shell's a nice shell, but it's not the only shell. There's lots of other shells, and I'd be happy if somebody created a replacement for it. And you know about open source. You know what it is and how it works and how valuable it's been in your life. Let everybody you know about that. This is my proselytizing for the day. So that's pretty much all I got, except that I have a big question. I want to know what's next. Where do we go from here? We've kind of achieved a certain level of dispersion of open source, a certain level of understanding about open source, and I think that there's another place to go from here. And in the interests of an open source meeting and an open meeting of minds, I'm hoping that you, the people I'm talking to right now, will tell me where we go from here. So I'll take any questions about anything except my Bertillon measurements. You can Google that. Yes, sir?
So how did your love of Linux and in general influence your decision when designing Bash scripting?
So did you ask me how did my love of Linux help me when designing the Bash scripting language?
Yes.
You should ask me, how is it that my Bash scripting language influenced Linus Torvalds to write the thing? Because that's the actual order of events. So in 1987, I By the way I wrote the shell, the way in which I came to write the shell was this. I said to Richard, I did some stuff, now what? He says, we need a shell. I said, okay, I can invent a shell. He says, no, we need one that looks exactly like Stephen Bourne's shell, so it can run all of the existing scripts. I said, okay, I guess I can do that. And he says, then get it done. There was a guy who worked on it. He worked on it for 3 months, and he's failed. So he's out. So you get it done, he says to me. So I was done with it in about 7 months. The last 4 months were pretty nerve-wracking. And then the Bash shell got called the Bash shell, for those of you who don't know, because it actually stands for the Born Again shell in reference to Stephen Bourne. I wanted to call it Elsa in relationship to this, to the idea that there was a movie called Born Free, and I wanted to call this the Born Free shell, but we didn't call it that. So I wrote the shell to satisfy the need of my boss and the need of the GNU system to have a freely available shell. I wrote read line and history because I'm not a maniac and nobody wants to type to a shell that doesn't have, command line completion and all that. I wrote those things as libraries because, once again, I'm not an idiot and I want to be able to reuse the stuff that I did, and I wanted to use that in GDB, and I wanted to use it in FTP, and I wanted to use it everywhere I was going to type to a command line. So there were some good things that came out of that. But I do think that without the Bash shell, I don't think Linus would have written the kernel, because he needed kind of all those things in place to have a system that could take his kernel. It's a big undertaking to write an entire Unix system, and it's amazing that Stallman put that out there. So I hope that answers your question. Yes?
So, adding on, like, what is the best way, especially for, like, you get involved in it? Like, assuming that we know how to program, but assuming that, like, maybe we weren't to say, like, Node.js, but we don't know how to get involved. How would you?
So, and the question is, how do you contribute? How do you start contributing to open source as a university student? I tell everybody the same thing. Scratch your own itch first. There's something that doesn't work right, something you don't like. You can't stand the way iOS is jacked up with iMessage. You don't like the way the Contacts app works. You think Emacs has got a crummy VI emulation, but you need to use it for something. Fix those things that are bugging you, or create something brand new to solve that problem. And it's not a daunting task. Sometimes it just seems that way. You think, oh, everybody's writing tons of software all the time. I'm going to be bogged down writing this little... No. The software you write will be very useful for somebody who has the exact same problem that you have. And there's millions and millions and millions of people who need that. And so it doesn't have to be the thing that you think shakes and changes the world. When I wrote the shell, I was just writing utility. I had written ls before that, then I wrote the shell, and then I wrote something after that. I was just writing software, right? Does that help? You can also just start contributing to existing projects, because there's tons of software out there and all of it's crap, right? So go ahead and fix it all. Yes, sir.
There's a quote that I think is attributed to that, which is something along the lines, there are dark corners in the Born cell, people use all of them. What's
So-
your favorite dark corner?
No. No. So I'd never heard that quote, but I can kind of tell you my perspective on that. So I started writing the shell, and I was just going to write it kind of like just write a parser by hand. I understood that. And Richard said, no, I want us to use Bison. It's the new version of Yak. And I said, what is Yak? It was Bison, and so it's a compiler. You give it a nice formatted input language, and it outputs piles of code that's supposed to parse things that fit that grammar. So you can say in the grammar, like a command comes, and then there should be something that ends a command, and then another command can come, and then you define what those things are. So I said, okay, fine, I'll write it in Bison. So I start writing the whole thing in Bison. I'm like, this isn't so bad. I mean, after all, this shell's a programming language. It's got, reasonable syntax and everything. I write a little of it, and then I go, oh, except that there's this one weird case where the $ works differently if you have a backslash in front of it, and then I'll just add that. Oh, except that in this case, if you're inside these sets of quotes, so the whole thing became like this series of weird little one-offs, and I ended up writing this massive. When you write a grammar, you have to write something that reads tokens and gives the tokens to the grammar. The tokenizer I wrote is like, it's this big compared to everything else in the shell because it was had to know about everything and had to be so specific. It was very odd. So that's one place where I thought that was weird. The other thing that happened was I was co-opted to be on the POSIX committee for the shell because I'm writing a shell. And David Korn had written a shell. And David Korn was on the POSIX committee also. And David Korn would say things like this: the shell should have arrays. And I'd say, why? And he'd say, because my shell has arrays. And then that was true for every single feature in David Korn's shell. So I managed to keep about 30% of them out, but there's still some weird ones in there like FC edit. So if you don't know what FC edit is, just type help FC edit. I'm going to tell you about help, though. So I start using a Linux machine. I mean, it wasn't a Linux machine. I start using a Unix box, and I don't know how to get any help, because the way you get help is by typing man. So I thought it was very odd that you couldn't type help. So I added help to the shell, and then people would say to me, I need help. Where do I get it? And I'd say, type help. And they'd say, what? You can do that? So I believe that bash is the first program on any Unix machine that has a command in it called help, which I think is hysterical. Sorry, you had another question.
No, I was just going to follow up on that. Do you have the same exact? Because I've
Bison.
been involved in
Yeah.
I've been involved in another open source project where we wanted to have our own bash part
Yep.
as part of this workflow management.
Yep.
We tried to do it and to render. We wanted to just follow a bash library to do the parsing for it. But we didn't end up doing that because I thought that it was a Python.
Oh, no, it's a tokenizer. You just say, here's some input, give me back a data structure, which is the input.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So I found that I can't do very complicated things. People are like, oh, you did this, you wrote this, you wrote that. Wow, you can do all these complicated things. And I'm like, I can't do complicated things. I can only do really simple things. So every problem that I'm given, I try to tear apart into some small, simple problems that I'm capable of solving. And then I solve those problems. So the reason there's a tokenizer in there is I took that as one separate problem to solve. Here, I just need something that will generate a data structure, because over here, if I just have a data structure, I can just do it, right? So I don't do complex. You got to do simple. Yes.
You asked where we were heading next, and I agree that open source is saturated in the open source world. But what we've kind of seen happen on the internet is moving away from federated services, like early internet, where IRC1, not everything is federated. Now, I mean, almost all your friends are on Facebook, and you don't want to see them. You can't find them as much anymore. So my question to you is how can we get back to proper federated software? I mean, I can do my part to get people on Mastodon, but how do we reach that saturation point federated software?
So your question is, how can we get rid of the World Wide Web and go back to Gopher?
Yeah.
So, so I'm in total stealth mode, and I'm not allowed to tell anyone about this at all. But I'm working on a project which is decentralizing the internet again. Because the internet started off as Gopher, totally decentralized, and you just thought, why not leave all this information where it belongs with the people who control it, and then we'll just go ask them, hey, what's the information? And then the World Wide Web happened, and that was great, and then everybody started to centralize everything. We have massive amounts of ISPs that all your data flows through. We have all your data being stored in giant databases. We have Google, who's collected the entire world and put it in one place for you to go get, which is, somewhat convenient, but also very centralized. And I don't want all the data that I think about going through my ISP. My ISP, as I mentioned earlier to somebody, my ISP knows my name, they have my credit card number, they have my address, and now they know every single website I go to and everything I bought from Amazon. And I'm not that happy about that. I don't really like the fact that my ISP now has the legal right to sell that information to anybody they want. You know, I'm a fan of sci-fi movies, and what's the Tom Cruise movie where he walks into a store and the thing can see his... I don't want to live in that world. I don't need to. I'm happy to communicate with individuals and get the things I need. So rather than have all my traffic flow through a central point, why don't I have it flow through all of these devices that are connected to the internet? There's no reason why everything has to flow through a level 3 router. It can if it's packaged up in some kind of baseball where you can't really tell what's in there, and that's a pile of traffic from a whole bunch of different people. I'm happy to let somebody give me a big piece of copper to run my data through, but I really don't want them to be, as we call layer 7, looking at my data. I don't want somebody to say, oh, I understand what website you're browsing to, and I can connect that to you and your personal life and your kids' names and all that. It's not my world. Did I answer your question? All right. So, did you say, is that Pied Piper? Yeah, people have said that to me before, and I actually think Pied Piper got the idea from us, so we'll see. We'll find out. Yes, yes. I'm mostly deaf, so it sounds to me like what you said was a lot of people have proprietary. Maybe you should say it again.
A lot of the open source.
Yes. Yes.
Well, they're largely open source. We have a growing number of proprietary open source elements. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
No, this go, so yeah, 100%. You said, for example, I showed some phones, and the core of the phone is Android. Well, that's open source, right? But there's these proprietary bits and pieces around it, and screw them, right? So, yeah, I agree 100%. That's because those Android morons didn't use the GPL. So, so all you have to do to prevent that from happening is make sure you use the right open source license. The license that says, if you use my stuff, you can't stop other people from using it, and if you add to my stuff and you're using it in a public way, you have to give that back. And so if people use the GPL, or now I would suggest the AGPL, so it works for stuff that you have on your website, for example, you don't run into this problem of, hey, I made something awesome, you're using it, you added something proprietary to it that's awesome, and only you can get the benefits of that proprietary thing. No, we want to share that stuff. I mean, I want people to be able to make money. Don't get me wrong, I like money just fine. And I like selling things, and I like delivering value and getting paid for that. I don't believe that when you buy your microwave oven, you care about the source code that's in your microwave oven. You care about the microwave oven features. And I think that people make different microwave ovens for different people. Here's a $2,000 one, and here's a $50 one, and they both could have the exact same source code in them, and the other things around that oven could be completely different. So I don't think software is the only thing that counts here.
Making something open source, it makes it less secure, more vulnerable to attacks because people know what all the code is. What are your thoughts on that?
So, as you know, I'm a big proponent of this open source selection system. The main reason for that is this. If I have something that's closed source, the only people who can see it are the programmers who work on it and all the bad guys that hack into my system and look at it. Good guys don't hack in and steal things. So if I make it open source, the bad guys can still see it, but at least the good guys can see it too. And that means that the good guys can fix stuff that's broken, or make it more secure, or do whatever that is, and the bad guys can't get their exploits delivered as easily. If all the source code for everything was stored, quote unquote, on GitHub, or basically in the public eye, then if somebody said, and it was all built by individuals, then if somebody put something bad in there, you'd see the commit. And some watchdog, like the crazy maniac watchdogs at Wikipedia who won't let you change, a comma, somebody, somebody like that will come along and say, hey, you can't put that stuff in that thing. So that's my answer to that. I think that open source is inherently more secure because good people get a chance to see it. Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on WebDRM standards this summer?
On which?
On WebDRM.
Uh-huh.
Standards this summer and how it's not at all.
I have a lot of thoughts on DRM. Most of them are not available for public speaking. Yeah, like I said, I think open source should permeate your life, right? As far as I feel. It's an exchange of ideas. I'm a musician. I think that as a musician, you should be allowed to get money for the things that you do. I don't think the only time I should be paid is for a single performance. I think that if I'm providing value to you because you're listening to my music while you're doing your work or hanging out at your house with your girlfriend or whatever, then great, I'm glad I'm providing value, and maybe you can give some value back to me. A decentralized way for you to give that value back to me would be great, and a blockchain ledger might be one way to manage that kind of information flow, and so then there can still be something that says that quote-unquote property was mine and you get a chance to use it, but there's no reason why I would prevent somebody from hearing my music, right? It's a question of usage and, I don't know. That's what I think. You guys. You, sir. What happens if you're working on a proprietary project because you took that job, and you want to open source it, but you can't. You have to open source a part of it, right? And you can't. So I do some consulting for the Department of Energy and for the DoD. We helped build a system called Raptor X, which displays information. It's a GIS system, displays information in a graphical way, and it accepts information from devices and other sources in the field. It's used by the military. I know that for a fact, that it's used by the military for various things. They deploy some sensors and all this stuff. The people who create some of the sensors, they're security clearance people. You have to have security clearance to work on that stuff. I never see that stuff. I explained to the department, we're going to make an open source system that has pluggable modules. And we'll make some example modules, and we'll even write some translation software that will take something over here that looks like it's existing and turn it into this other thing, and then you'll be able to plug into this open source system. So we said, we're going to create something that is open source that can take proprietary information if needed. The Linux kernel can do the exact same thing, and it does under certain systems, like under Ubuntu, for example. Not every kernel module is open source. So I think it's okay to have. I think it's possible that you're in a situation where convincing somebody to open source something is just not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to convince some security clearance guy that he should open source his missile control system. I can choose to not work on anything that's even remotely associated with that, or I can say, well, there's value in this GIS system that I built. It's really useful for helping people find lost other people. It's helpful for understanding whether a gas that's been disseminated in an area is going to be a danger for you. It can look at weather systems. It can help us with our keeping our electric grid system safe. It can do all those things. And so I think those things are important. I can't control the way in which everybody uses a piece of software. All I can do is try to make sure that the software I build upholds and pushes forth the values that I believe in. And you had a question also.
Before you touched on the security advantages of open source systems, and as you're working in open source coding, this is very important. But how do you create an open source distribution system that actually has a good level of oversight to protect from hidden nefarious contributions? I'm thinking of systems like Node, where really anyone can push up any GitHub repo, and now it's in the standard list of things for today. VMware.
So, yeah, how do you control the quality of your open source. Is that fair? Not really?
Well, security and quality.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But you're right, the problem occurs when you're getting poor quality.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, you know, a nefarious, malicious piece of code is poor quality. So, so I'm less of a bazaar type guy. I'm much more of a cathedral type guy. I'm referring to a paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. You might want to look it up, but it talks about how you manage your open source project. In my experience, you need to have a small contained control group that is completely clear on what the vision, what the mission is of this project, and what your vision for, okay, it's complete now is. You need to have that core view so that everything that comes in your way, you can look at and say, is this in line with this vision or not? When I was working on the shell, the way I met Chet Ramey is I was working on the shell, and he would ship me patches. And he'd be like, here's a patch that does this. And I'd say, that's not a good patch for this shell. It changes the behavior of the shell. It doesn't leave it open for this other thing that I want to do. And he'd be like, oh, okay. And he'd ship me a different patch. And I'd be like, not that one. But eventually, and then I would try to answer his, address his issue in a different way. It's not that he didn't have valid issues. It's that sometimes he just wanted to solve a problem immediately and kind of ignored what happened outside of that. And over time, the patches he shipped were patches that I could trust and accept. And then I was working on the job control system, and I asked him to write a large portion of that. And he wrote a large portion of the job control system in the bash shell. It was a significant contribution. And so about a year later, when I left, I said, why don't you be the maintainer? And he was the maintainer. And he's been the maintainer ever since. So without that kind of tight control, things would have gone into the shell that didn't work for the shell, right? He just thought they were good ideas, but they were not good ideas at that time for the shell. So I think the way you do it is you actually have a small group or a committee. You could, if there's 10,000 people working on it, I guess you should vote a committee into place that looks at every single change. In my organization, anytime somebody pushes into a Git repo, we run our own Git repos. Anytime somebody pushes into a Git repo, I get an email. I mean, many people get an email, but I get an email with the changes in it. For any repo, it's a lot of email. But sometimes you can tell just by glancing at the commit log and kind of like what's there, whether or not that person is thinking along the lines of where that project's supposed to go. And that helps you to explain, no, we don't want to do it that way, we want to do it this way. So. Yes? Mm-hmm.
And there was this occupation and everything, and I was fully on board with it. I loved the one thing that I've noticed is that there's been a shift in terms of community acceptance since DPL3 came out.
Yeah.
And a lot of controversy. I was wondering if you could talk about your perspective on DPL3, and has it been harder to convince people to use DPL?
Yeah, it's been, the question is it, the world doesn't like GPL v3 as much as I do. What can I do to fix that? And also, yeah, what can I do to fix? So, I used to argue. I argued with Richard Stallman very heavily about the readline and history libraries. I said the readline library shouldn't be under GPL. It should be under the LGPL. And we argued about that endlessly. And the end result was we changed the LGPL in some ways. Some people don't want to embrace this concept of full-on sharing because they're concerned that it means they're giving something up. And so with those people, I personally spend a lot of time explaining why you're not giving something up. They say, oh, I thought about this problem for 6 months, and then I finally figured out the answer, and then I wrote the solution, and now I have the solution here, and you just want me to make this open source in a way that I can't sell it, is what they kind of think. Or that makes other people not want to use it because then everything they do to it, they'll have to give back. And I say, yeah, that's right. I exactly want that. I want it that if somebody else uses this hard work that you've created here, that they then have to give back to you. And if they're not willing to do that, they can't use your hard work. And then people, but I won't be able to get famous like you and disseminate software. And then that's the only reason I wrote the software. I'm like, that's the only reason you wrote the software. Then we're all done having this conversation. You can do whatever you want to do. But if you actually if you wanted this to be open source because you wanted the world to be able to use it, then force that to be true. Make it so that the world can use this and not just that guy over there. Because if you just wanted that guy over there to use it, then you should have made a proprietary software and told everybody, I have this proprietary software, and you can license the source code from me for a song. So I get very kind of up in arms. I think that some programmers don't like the idea that a license is controlling in some way. They like to feel like they have complete control over the software they've written. But if you've written software and you're going to give it away, then you don't get complete control. And this current organization I'm working with, the project we're doing is 100% open source. The world will own all of the source code. And they say to me, well, if we do it this way, and everybody's on board with that, but they say they're concerned about the code being forked and somebody else doing what we're doing that doesn't have the exact same ideals that we have. And I explained, if we're any good at our jobs, that won't happen. Our job is to make sure that this code is the best code it can be and that it just keeps getting better. And if that's the case, forking it doesn't make sense. I don't know anybody who's forked the Apache web server, although maybe somebody has, but I don't know about them because the Apache web server doesn't need to be forked. Forking it would be bad for you. You're just taking on an extra maintenance job. And that's true for most of the software I use. Nobody's forking Linux, right? So I don't think that one's a valid thing to worry about either. I don't know if I actually answered your question, but I tried. You had a question, yeah?
What do you think about when the shell shock was?
I was very excited. So the question was, what about the shell shock bug? What did you think when the shell shock bug came out? For those of you who don't know, shell shock was in the shell, if you start running the shell with an environment variable set to equal a function, the function gets, that code that looks like a function gets executed when the shell starts up. And this is a big problem if you're running your shell as the CGI command on your web server and somebody connects to your web server and does some stuff. So there was a big uproar about this, and it got a lot of press, and then the New York Times called me up, and they said, this is a horrible bug in the software that you wrote in 1987 before the internet was created. That's a huge bug for that software that might be running in this weird way on the internet. What were you thinking when you wrote this? And I said, aha, my plan worked. And then they printed that, so I was pretty happy about that. Yeah, I mean, shell shock, I'm pretty happy that we found, a bug in the shell after 30 years. That's just not that bad. And my friend Jay Freeman, I'm actually super excited about this. My friend Jay Freeman, who you might know as Sork, he's the jailbroken phone guy. He was at the Pony Awards, PWNY Awards, which is where they give out awards for most significant bug. And then they had an award that they were giving out at that conference for the least significant bug, and they awarded it to Shell Shock. And then they started asking, is the author of Bashir? No. Well, does anybody know him? Eventually, Jay accepted the award on my behalf. So on my desk, I have a little, troll pony, which is the thing. So I'm pretty happy about that. Hi. I need some help. Anybody want to tell me what he said? You asked, would it be in the business interest of Snapchat or Instagram to open source their stuff? Sure, why not? Are you going to use a different system other than Instagram because it's open sourced, or are you going to use Instagram while all your friends are? Sorry, I missed that. I'm sorry. Before critical mass, if they had open sourced it on day one, would that have been a bad move? I'm a businessman. I've made some businesses. I've been okay at that. I don't think that the source code to your application is why you succeed when you're building something like Snapchat or Instagram. I think it's your marketing and your targeting of the specific people you're trying to hit and the messaging all around that. I think that's a super important part, and not the source code itself. So you could, it's true that if you were lousy at that and you open sourced your project, but you were lousy at the marketing, and somebody was really great at marketing, and they picked up your code, that they could make that work. And that might have happened on a few projects, actually. I mean, I kind of think that did happen on a few projects. It might have happened with Linux. We've got, guys out there that are competing to sell you a distribution, and some of them sell more than others, right? And Linus is not selling his distribution. So arguably that can happen, but I don't think it's because the source is open. I think it's because your business wasn't set up to succeed. I can imagine. I'll stipulate. I can imagine that there's a situation in which it matters. So let's take fidgets, little spinners. So somebody made a spinner. It's pretty clever, right? As soon as the spinner showed up, everybody and their brother made a spinner. And there's like 65 companies in China. All they do is make spinners. And you can't tell which spinner you got. Some of them are cheaper quality than others or whatever. There's now kind of no branding on spinners. So as far as I'm concerned, spinners are an example of open source kind of gone rampant in a business world that had no specific marketing tied to a specific company. And so that was the end result of that. The end result was everybody can get a fidget, and they don't have to spend a lot of money, and they can decide whether they want the one with the diamond edge blades on it or the one that's made of plastic. And that's up to them. Does that kind of fit what you're talking about? About enforcing the GPL? Oh. It hasn't been that challenging for me. I don't do that much. Yeah, enforcing the GPL can be, it's a bit of a pain, but for a while, in the beginning it was difficult, and Stallman did all that work almost himself, for I would say the first 6 years or so, because there was no license like that. People thought they could just take things and use them. Linksys, built a whole router based on Linux and just forgot to release the source. And then we had to call them up and yell at them, could you please release the source to this thing, Sometimes we got ripped off. I was working for a company in the mid-90s, and I received a box that turned incoming SSL connections into non-SSL connections. That was the purpose of the box. And the box, when I looked inside, there was a way to talk to a command line. I was talking to a command line, and I said, this thing's definitely using the read line library. There's some little tricks in there. I can tell which is which. This is using the read line library. And then I was able to break out of the read line library, and I realized, the thing's running bash also. So this proprietary box that they sold for $10,000, was built on all this free software. The thing was running FreeBSD, and the proprietary part of it was some scripts, really, to connect things together. So, what can you do? You can yell at those people, and somebody did, but eventually they released the source of the box because it doesn't really matter. Nobody else is going to take that source and make that exact same box. So, yeah, it's hard to enforce, but you can give it a shot. The PowerShell guy. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Actually, before I ask this question,
Yeah.
I almost linked PowerShell to Readline for PowerShell on Linux. We were this close. It was suggested because .NET Core port didn't have readkey yet, and we could read key by key the whole line. Of course, we need a Readline library, but LGPL and Microsoft.
Yeah, why don't you fix that?
Right, I'm trying.
You did a pretty good job so far, right?
Yeah. It's getting better.
Yeah.
It's something I might do. Like I had my boss convinced for 3 days that it should go GPL, but she didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
That got changed by pretty quick. Question for you though was, do you do stand-up comedy like Richard Stallman?
First of all, I don't do anything like Richard Stallman. No, I don't do any stand-up comedy, and no, I don't do anything like Richard Stallman.
Or a better question, has he always been like that? He just started doing like stand-up comedy.
I haven't heard him do any stand-up comedy, so I can't tell you how good that is. I've heard him play the recorder. He's quite good at playing Renaissance music on his recorder. I stopped him from eating the skin off his toes one day, and he hasn't done that since, as far as I know. He's been to my house for Christmas twice, and the second time he was much better behaved after I read him the riot act for not being well behaved, because my mother, who was amazingly well behaved, said to me after he left, "Your friend is odd." But Richard is he's an amazing human being. He's an amazing individual, and you take it all as one gestalt. And I'll tell you a quick story. He had. I was already impressed kind of with his drive and focus, and we went out to. Sorry, just reminded me of a different story. But we went out to eat Chinese food with this guy he knew who was doing his PhD in philosophy, and he was in the middle of this guy was in the middle of writing his thesis, and he was almost done, and he'd run into a problem. So he has a problem in his PhD thesis in philosophy, and the three of us go out to dinner, and the guy says, "Richard, I've got this problem." And he starts talking about the problem that he has in his PhD, and Richard's eating, and then he just looks at the guy and goes, "Well, maybe you should do it like this." And the guy goes, "Oh yeah, that solves that problem." And then I was like, "Yeah, okay, I guess." Certain brains work certain ways, and that was a real eye opener for me to see that kind of expanded across a wide range of fields, endeavors. Sí, señor.
Platform, or like embrace the fact that like GitHub has like social communities and like people
Yeah. So I don't think you should support the evil empire, but I don't think GitHub is the evil empire, right? And so I think that using tools that allow you to actually get your job, you're focused on a mission, right? You're making open source software because you want to deliver this value to somebody, and you want to make that thing that scratches your itch. So those two things you're focused on, that's what you should actually remain focused on, and not worry too much about whether you're on GitHub or GitLab, because until GitHub screws you, you're fine. And the only way they're going to screw you is by saying, we don't have free accounts anymore, right? And then you pull that off and put it on GitLab or run your own server or do what you need to do. But until that happens, they're doing a service, and it's easy access for people, and they can get it what they want. So, what I think. Yes! My work on which? I missed it. Sorry, one person. Oh, voting systems. Can I talk about the election systems? Yes. Thank you. Yes, I'd love to talk about that. So, where could I start? So I had been working with a guy named, I'm working with a guy named Brent Turner. We started an organization called CAVO, which is the California Association of Voting Officials. And we had a large number of people in that organization, including many voting officials from California and including the not current Secretary of State. We also, of California, not of the U.S. We also started the National Association of Voting Officials, and we're pushing that for a little bit. We then started working with a guy named Juan Gilbert. I have my own ideas on voting systems. We built one in 2007 and ran it at a Linux Expo. It worked extremely well, did all the tallying, did everything it was supposed to do and the way it's supposed to work. But I didn't think that we should have one system, and I didn't think that system was the best system. I wanted better ideas and more ideas to keep soliciting and that kind of stuff. I've worked with a guy named Dr. Juan Gilbert in Florida, who also has an open source system. It's running in New Hampshire, and I think it's going to be running in Wisconsin in 2018, some places in Wisconsin in 2018. But it's mostly for access, for allowing people who are handy capable to get in there and do the things they need to do, including if they're hard of hearing or if they're have eyesight problems or whatever. There's a group in New York that was working on a blockchain voting system, which I think is fantastic, but in order to use a fully working blockchain voting system in the US, we would have to change some laws. Currently, I'm not allowed to be able to prove how I voted to someone else. That's so that you can't coerce my vote and then I'm able to prove it to you. So currently I'm not allowed to do that in the US against the law. I think that law is a little outdated and doesn't fit a country of 350 million people anymore. But until that's changed or until we have a different way of doing it, voting on the blockchain is not a straightforward, viable solution. So mostly what we're looking at is systems that have full-on paper backup, but that are automated enough to make the process of counting 150 million or 200 million votes rapid. I'm also personally interested in internet voting, but I'm not here to let somebody scream at me about internet voting. Yeah? All right. Yes? Yeah. Well, I mean, we built, I'm not sure what the question is. You mean, how do we tackle? Yeah, our systems don't suck like the other systems. No, sorry. Yeah, the physical system, the physical system we're talking about is basically all ROM-based. There's nothing that you can swap out there. The tallying isn't done in a way, it's not centralized in a way that you can just tweak one bit and then go, see, there's a lot more votes for this guy. You can't, there's nothing secret about it. It's almost transparent. The only thing that's not transparent is you're the person that cast that vote. But it's transparent enough that you can say there were 340 people here and 340 people voted, and most of those people seem happy with the outcome of the tally on the wall. So stuff like that, right? Like one of the things we do is we just put up on the wall what the tally is, and you don't do it in real time. You have to kind of stagger it or whatever, and then people can be like, oh, okay, I understand now. You know, most of us voted for that guy, and that seems correct. So I'm good. You guys good? All right. Well, thank you very much. I really. I super appreciated all the questions, and thanks for making me think more. I'm looking forward to more open source conversations. And especially thanks to you, and That's it.